few years, incidents involving the abuse, torture, and dehumanizing of prisoners of war, exposed by leaked pictures and eyewitness accounts, have caused outrage around the world. Some guilty officers and wardens were trialed and sentenced to jail, whilst the real criminals have not been brought to justice.
And Common Article 3 basically says that when you have a detainee, irrespective of who they are, irrespective of whether they're a prisoner of war, a combatant or non-combatant, you have to treat them with humanity. You cannot impose outrages against their dignity. You cannot abuse them. You cannot be cruel to them. You cannot torture them. And that is a bottom line rule that applies at all times and in all circumstances and reflects general international law. That is well established in what you've called the Code of Combatants in international law. It's often not respected, but it provides a benchmark against which one decides whether or not an act or a form of treatment is legitimate and lawful or not.
The central thing I think to focus on if we want to limit these kind of violations is not tighter and tighter rules by international lawyers to circumscribe states. We've got to cut directly to the reason why states are doing it. They're doing it because they believe they'll get an advantage. Do they actually get an advantage? I'm thinking of studying torture. I don't believe torture provides much of any real advantage. So what's the case for torture?
Many practices that are contrary to human rights are being increasingly justified as means to obtain important intelligence and to fight the war on terror in general. Unsurprisingly, this has resulted in much international and domestic debate over the effectiveness of these methods. The Islamic perspective on this matter, however, is crystal clear.
Muslims are not allowed to torture or dehumanize prisoners of war, irrespective of how they are designated.
It is rule number 2 in the Islamic Code of Combat. Prisoners of war are not to be killed or tortured. This rule is solidly established, and it was clearly observed during numerous incidents during the Prophet's time.
After the Muslims were forced to immigrate from Mecca to Medina, an armed conflict began between the Muslims and the tribe of Quraysh, which lasted more than 8 years. Known as the Battle of Badr, this was the first in a field of battles that took place between the Muslims and their enemies. In the year 624 AD, a small, poorly prepared army of 317 Muslims met a heavily supplied army of 1,000 Meccan idolaters. The night before the battle took place, an intelligent unit of 3 companions of the Prophet arrested 2 men who were bringing water from the army of Quraysh. The Prophet's wisdom shone in his chosen method to extract information from them. It is a clear display of the high standard of morality to be implemented when dealing with prisoners of war.
During one of the battles, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, criticized his companions for beating 2 prisoners of war in an attempt to obtain some information. This was an immoral act, and in torturing the prisoners, the information was also unreliable.
The Prophet, peace be upon him, had a different approach to the situation. He simply asked the 2 prisoners, "How many camels do you slaughter every day?" They said, "Some days 9 camels, some days 10 camels." He looked at his companions and he said, "Then the army is between 900 and 1,000, as 1 camel feeds 100 men." The Prophet's technique in obtaining information during war was far removed from any violence or dehumanization of prisoners of war.
Muslims are not allowed to torture prisoners of war physically or even psychologically. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, blamed one of his companions for walking some prisoners of war along a path where they saw their dead before the burial. He said, "O Bilal, don't you have mercy in your heart?"
In fact, Islamic teachings go even further in encouraging good treatment for prisoners of war. The Quran describes it as an expression of love for God. The Quran says, and out of love for Allah, they feed the poor, the orphan, and the prisoner of war.
ويطعمون الطعام على حبه مسكينا ويتيما وأسيرا.
In 630 AD, the Prophet Muhammad led an army of 10,000 Muslims. Till that day, it was the biggest army ever to march in Arabia. They marched towards Mecca, which was to surrender to him peacefully, without a single blow of conflict.
For more than 20 years, the people of Mecca caused nothing but hardship for the Prophet. They persecuted him and his followers while they were in Mecca. And they waged wars against them after their migration to Medina.
People usually accept, peace treaties when they're unable to sway a battle in their favor. The Prophet, peace be upon him, when he comes into Mecca, he comes in now as the dominator, as the guy in charge, if he wants to be. But how does he come in? With humility, with tranquility, with forgiveness, with an open heart. It's almost unbelievable to see someone that could act in this fashion towards people who killed his uncles, who persecuted him, who embargoed him, who treated him with such evil actions, that he comes back and says what? To these prisoners of war, he says, whoever wants to be safe, let them go to the house of Abu Sufyan. Abu Sufyan was the greatest enemy of the Prophet. So this is a historical moment which Muslims have to reflect on from that time to the end of time on how Muslims should treat their adversaries in war.
The Meccans gathered, and the Prophet mercifully asked them, "What do you think I will do with you?" With fear in their hearts and tears in their eyes, they said, "You are a noble brother and a noble nephew."
Prophet Muhammad announced a universal pardon. He said, "No reproach upon you this day. May Allah forgive you." And their lives were spared, and their homes and properties remained in their possession.
500 years later, Salah al-Din, a Muslim leader, would follow in the footsteps of Prophet Muhammad in dealing with prisoners of war after defeating his enemies in one of the bloodiest battles of all time.